A traffic stop with a shocking twist. When a black judge, Olivia Carter, is profiled by a racist police officer, her composed yet powerful response turns the moment into a movement. This story of courage and accountability will leave you speechless. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and violet. Olivia Carter exhaled a sigh of relief as she navigated her sleek black sedan through the quiet suburban streets. The day had been long, a courtroom filled with tense arguments, sharp objections, and a mountain of paperwork. But now, she was finally heading home. The sound of the long-drawn nails, of the clutch wrench, seemed to echo in her head when she was hurrying down the street. Dressed in a crisp white blouse beneath a tailored black blazer, Olivia looked every inch the accomplished professional she was. Her hair, neatly pulled back, framed her face, which carried an air of quiet confidence. As the gentle strains of soft jazz floated through her car's speakers, she allowed herself to relax, the rhythm of the music washing away the tension of the day. Olivia, yeah, trying to read these lines that are like 15 words long. The road was almost deserted, with only a few cars passing by. Streetlights flickered to life, casting a warm glow over the asphalt. Olivia glanced at the clock on the dashboard. 7:42 p.m. Just a few more minutes, and she'd be home. She thought about the warm cup of tea waiting for her, and the novel she'd been meaning to finish. I want you. Then, out of nowhere, flashing red and blue lights filled her rearview mirror. The piercing wail of a siren shattered the calm. Her heart skipped a beat, but Olivia's hands remained steady on the wheel. She blinked in confusion. What could this possibly be about? She slowed down, carefully steering her car to the shoulder of the road. The police vehicle stopped behind her, the flashing lights bouncing off the darkened windows of her sedan. We were there to... Taking a deep breath, Olivia reached for her purse, pulling out her license and registration. Years of practicing law had taught her to remain composed in moments like these, even when her instincts urged her to question the situation. In her side mirror, she saw the officer approach. He was a tall man in his mid-40s with a stern expression etched onto his face. His uniform was crisp, but the way he carried himself suggested authority laced with impatience. Reaching her window, the officer tapped on the glass. Olivia rolled it down smoothly, offering him a polite smile. "Good evening, officer. Is there a problem?" Cab said. "License and registration," he barked, ignoring her question entirely. His tone was clipped, devoid of courtesy. Olivia hesitated for a fraction of a second before handing over the documents. "May I ask why I've been pulled over?" The officer, whose name tag read Bradley, barely glanced at her license before responding. "Routine stop," he said tersely. His eyes flicked over her, lingering for a moment too long on her face and the way she was dressed. Olivia could almost feel the weight of his judgment. "Is that so?" she asked, her tone calm but firm. "This doesn't feel routine." Bradley's lip curled slightly, his demeanor growing colder. "What are you doing in this neighborhood?" he asked abruptly, ignoring her question. Olivia's brows furrowed slightly, though her composure didn't waver. "I'm on my way home," she replied simply. "This doesn't seem like the kind of area for someone like you," he muttered, his words dripping with insinuation. The weight of his comment hung in the air, unspoken but crystal clear. Olivia's grip on the steering wheel tightened ever so slightly. Her instincts told her this wasn't about a traffic violation. Kate watched, hoping for something, some glimmer of hope that Olivia would have something to say. She met his gaze, her voice steady but edged with resolve. "Officer, I believe I have the right to know why I was stopped." Bradley didn't answer immediately. Instead, he studied her car, her demeanor, as though searching for something, anything, that would justify his actions. The road remained eerily silent, the occasional car passing by without slowing. A tension Olivia hadn't felt in years began to creep up her spine, but she refused to let it show. "I'll be back," Bradley said curtly, turning on his heel and walking toward his patrol car. Olivia exhaled slowly, her eyes following him in the mirror. Something about the way he moved, his clipped tone, told her this was more than a random stop. As the soft jazz played faintly in the background, she squared her shoulders. Whatever this is, she thought, I'm ready. Bradley returned to Olivia's window, his face set in a stony mask. He held her license and registration in one hand, tapping them rhythmically against his other palm. His posture loomed, deliberate, and pointed. Where exactly are you coming from? He asked, his tone sharp. Olivia, still seated with her hands resting lightly on the steering wheel, met his gaze evenly. I'm coming from work, she said. Don't blame it there, Olivia said with a laugh. Bradley's eyes narrowed slightly. Work, huh? What kind of work brings you to this neighborhood at this hour? Olivia paused for a moment, recognizing the direction his questions were taking. She had heard this tone before, seen this script play out in courtrooms, on news stories, in whispers shared by friends. It was a tone heavy with assumption, cloaked in authority. I'm a federal employee, she replied, her voice calm but firm. Bradley's lips twitched, a flicker of skepticism crossing his face. A federal employee, he repeated, the words dripping with doubt. He leaned in slightly. Let me guess, you're a social worker? Maybe a paralegal? Bit, he said. The implication hung in the air. Olivia's expression didn't waver. Does my job have anything to do with why you stopped me? She asked evenly. His smile was cold, more of a sneer than anything else. Just answering some questions. That's not a problem, is it? He didn't respond immediately, letting the weight of his words settle between them. The soft hum of a passing car filled the silence before she finally said, If you tell me why you stopped me, I'd be happy to help. Sorry, Ryan, said Jay. Bradley exhaled sharply, his patience visibly thinning. Routine stop, he said again, his tone clipped. He stepped back and scanned her car, his eyes flicking from the sleek black exterior to the passenger seat, as though expecting to find something incriminating. Olivia watched him carefully. Every move he made felt deliberate, a performance for an unseen audience. What are you hiding? Bradley asked suddenly, his voice sharper now. Olivia blinked, startled by the directness of the question. Excuse me? He gestured vaguely toward her car. You're awfully defensive for someone who claims to have nothing to hide. Olivia leaned back slightly in her seat, drawing in a slow, measured breath. Officer, I've complied with everything you've asked so far. If you have specific concerns, I suggest you state them clearly. Bradley's jaw tightened. Her calm composure seemed to unnerve him, and he glanced back toward his patrol car, as though weighing his next move. When he turned back to her, his expression was a mixture of irritation and suspicion. I'm gonna need to search your vehicle, he said bluntly. Olivia arched a brow, the first visible crack in her otherwise serene demeanor. And what exactly are you searching for? Let's call it probable cause, he shot back. Her fingers tightened on the steering wheel, but her voice remained steady. You don't have probable cause, and without it, you don't have the right to search my car. Bradley stepped closer, his shadow falling across her lap. Are you refusing to cooperate? I'm exercising my rights, Olivia said, her tone unwavering. There's a difference. Gerard only smiled at her affection. The tension between them was palpable now, thick enough to feel in the air. Nearby, a couple walking a dog paused, their heads turning toward the unfolding scene. Across the street, a car slowed down, the driver craning his neck to get a better look. Bradley noticed the growing attention, his eyes flicking briefly to the bystanders before returning to Olivia. You're making this harder than it needs to be, he said. Lowering his voice, Ulitness reported to her parents on. Olivia tilted her head slightly, her expression unreadable. I think that depends on your definition of hard, she replied. For a moment, neither spoke. The stillness was broken only by the occasional whoosh of a passing car and the soft rustle of leaves in the breeze. Bradley straightened, shoving her license and registration into his pocket. "Stay here," he snapped, before turning on his heel and marching back to his patrol car. Olivia watched him go, her heart pounding despite her calm exterior. She knew what this was, a blatant case of profiling, cloaked in procedural language. But she also knew something else. She had nothing to fear, not because of her title, not because of her status, but because she understood the law better than most. As Bradley climbed into his patrol car, Olivia adjusted her posture, sitting a little taller. She glanced in her side mirror, catching sight of her own reflection. Her expression was calm, her eyes steady. "Let's see what you do next, Officer Bradley," she thought, her grip on the wheel loosening slightly. The quiet suburban street began to stir as the tension between Olivia and Officer Bradley simmered. A couple walking their dog had stopped on the sidewalk, their conversation forgotten as their eyes fixed on the confrontation. Across the road, a woman in a parked car rolled down her window, her phone raised discreetly, recording. "What's going on over there?" a cyclist muttered to a jogger as he slowed down, pointing toward the scene. The soft hum of attention grew louder, drawing more bystanders. A young man in a hoodie, no older than 20, stood near a lamppost, phone in hand, recording boldly. His voice cut through the air. "Why are you stopping her? She didn't do anything." Bradley glanced briefly at the onlookers, but didn't acknowledge the question. His focus remained on Olivia, who sat calmly in her car, hands resting on the steering wheel, and writing letters to his helpers. "Step out of the car," Bradley demanded, his voice louder now. The calm authority he'd initially attempted to project was slipping, replaced by frustration. Olivia didn't move. She met his gaze with unshakable composure. "Officer, unless you can provide a lawful reason for this stop, I'm not required to comply with your request," she said evenly. Bradley's jaw clenched. "You're being uncooperative," he shot back. "Uncooperative?" Olivia repeated, her tone calm but firm. "I've given you my license and registration. I've answered your questions. The only thing I've refused is to forfeit my rights. That's not uncooperative. It's lawful." Her words, spoken with such poise, seemed to irritate him further. His face reddened as he took a step closer, towering over the window. "You're hiding something," he accused, his voice rising. "People like you always are." A sharp intake of breath rippled through the small crowd. The young man in the hoodie muttered, "Oh, hell no," loud enough for others to hear. A woman across the street gasped, her phone now raised higher, capturing every detail. So you're gonna be..." Olivia's expression didn't falter, though a flicker of anger passed through her eyes. "People like me?" she repeated softly. Olivia's laughter rang in her ears. "Not all of us. You know what?" Olivia interrupted. "I call you up." Bradley faltered for half a second but recovered quickly, doubling down. "You heard me," he said, his tone defensive now. "You're refusing to comply. That gives me the right to escalate this situation." "Escalate," Olivia said, her voice still calm but carrying a cutting edge. "I suggest you choose your next words very carefully, officer." What?" I asked. Olivia shook her head and tottered to her keyboard. Eventually, she saw it and smiled. "Oh." The onlookers murmured among themselves. Someone whispered, "She knows her stuff," while another said, "This is about to blow up." Bradley straightened, clearly trying to reassert control. "If you don't step out of the car," he said, his voice now dangerously low, "I'll call for backup. We'll conduct a full search, including a pat-down. Is that what you want?" Olivia tilted her head slightly, her calm demeanor now carrying a subtle warning. "And what grounds would you have for such a search?" she asked. Eric's footsteps grew louder, and he pushed some of the words out of his mouth. Bradley didn't answer immediately. Instead, he glanced at the growing crowd, clearly aware that more eyes and cameras were on him now. His posture stiffened, as he leaned closer to Olivia. Bradwith? Do Don't test me, he said through gritted teeth. Olivia remained still, her expression unchanged. Officer, I've been patient, I've been respectful, but I won't be intimidated into surrendering my rights. If you believe you have cause for a search, go ahead and call for backup. But I suggest you run my license first. You might find it enlightening. I with my knuckles. I just look at the muzzle perfectly and it's so many interesting things. The crowd fell silent at her words, the weight of her calm defiance settling over everyone. Bradley's eyes narrowed, his frustration palpable. For a moment, he hesitated, the growing attention clearly unnerving him. From the sidewalk, the young man in the hoodie called out again. Yeah, run her license. Let's see what you find. Oath. The comment drew a few chuckles from the crowd, but Bradley ignored it. He turned on his heel abruptly and marched back to his patrol car, his fists clenched at his sides. Olivia watched him go, her gaze steady. She could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on her shoulders, but she refused to let it show. Instead, she straightened in her seat, her hands still resting lightly on the wheel. The onlookers remained where they were, phones still raised, murmuring quietly amongst themselves. The tension in the air was thick, but there was also an undercurrent of anticipation. You know what? I'm fine, Reachert shot back quickly, the muscles in his jaw tense. Who do you think she is? Someone asked quietly. I don't know, another replied, but she's handling this like a pro. Bradley reached his patrol car, his movements stiff and hurried. Olivia could see him through her rearview mirror as he climbed in, slamming the door behind him. The young man in the hoodie turned to the couple nearby. This is gonna go viral, he said confidently. Olivia exhaled softly, her grip on the wheel loosening slightly. She glanced at her reflection in the side mirror, her expression resolute. Whatever happened next, she knew one thing for sure, she wouldn't back down. Skia cleared his throat, and then, releasing the 6-foot-long thing he was holding in his hands, he handed it to Byrne. Bradley sat in his patrol car, gripping the radio mic with white-knuckled tension. His movements were jerky as he punched Olivia's license information into the system. The glowing screen of his dashboard computer reflected off his face, but the usual confidence he carried on these stops seemed to falter. She thinks she's smarter than me, he muttered under his breath, his voice tinged with irritation. People like her always do. The phrase was bitter, as though Olivia's calm demeanor had struck a nerve he couldn't quite identify. The computer whirred, processing the data. Bradley tapped his fingers impatiently against the steering wheel, glancing toward the growing crowd. They hadn't dispersed. If anything, more people had gathered. Phones were still raised, recording his every move. Finally, the results popped up on the screen. Bradley leaned closer, squinting at the text. And then, he froze. The name stared back at him, bold and unrelenting. Olivia Carter, federal judge. You've seen the image. Come catch me. His breath hitched. A cold sweat broke out on his forehead as he reread the details, hoping he'd somehow made a mistake. But there it was, as clear as day. This wasn't just any driver he'd pulled over. This was one of the most respected legal minds in the state, someone with the power to hold him and his department accountable in ways he hadn't imagined. Damn it, he whispered, his voice barely audible. Bradley sat back in his seat, his mind racing. He thought about the way he'd spoken to her, the accusations he'd thrown, the pat-down threat. Every misstep replayed in his head, each one a nail in the coffin of his confidence. He glanced back toward Olivia's car. She was still sitting calmly, her posture steady, her hands resting lightly on the wheel. She hadn't moved, hadn't flinched, as though she'd known all along this moment would come. For a fleeting second, Bradley considered his options. He could play it off, pretend it was all a misunderstanding, but the crowd, the phones, and the undeniable truth on his computer screen left him with no room to maneuver. More. His pulse quickened as he grabbed her license and registration, stepping out of his patrol car with hesitant steps. The air outside felt heavier now, the weight of the crowd's gaze pressing down on him. Um. As he approached Olivia's window, his demeanor had changed entirely. The sharpness in his posture was gone, replaced by something closer to uncertainty. "Ma'am," he began, his voice quieter now, almost deferential. He cleared his throat, struggling to find the right words. I didn't realize who you were." Olivia turned her head toward him slowly, her expression unreadable. Her eyes held his for a moment, and the silence between them was deafening. "I apologize if I seemed harsh earlier," Bradley continued, stumbling over the words like a child caught in a lie. "It was never my intention to, make you uncomfortable." A flicker of something crossed Olivia's face. Disdain, perhaps, or pity. She unbuckled her seatbelt and pushed open the door. As she stepped out of the car, her full stature seemed to command the space around her. The murmurs in the crowd grew louder, their phones now trained intently on her. Even the young man in the hoodie, who had been so vocal earlier, fell silent, his phone steady in his hands. Olivia smoothed her blazer, her movements calm and deliberate, as though she had all the time in the world. She stood straight, her presence radiating quiet authority. "You didn't seem harsh," she said finally, her voice cutting through the murmurs like a blade. "You violated my rights because of the color of my skin." And she's like, Bradley flinched. "Ma'am, That's not an apology," Olivia interrupted, her tone steady but firm. "That's an excuse. And it's not acceptable." "Hey all." Bobby held his hand up. Bradley opened his mouth to speak again, but no words came out. The weight of her statement hung in the air, undeniable and damning. And then the weight of her statement hung in the air. Olivia took a step closer, her gaze unwavering. "You didn't run my license because you suspected me of a crime," she continued. "You ran it because you couldn't believe someone like me could be in this neighborhood, driving this car, dressed like this." "Huh," she said. The crowd murmured in agreement, a ripple of support spreading through the bystanders. "This is exactly the kind of behavior that undermines trust in law enforcement," Olivia said, her voice rising slightly but never losing its control. "Your badge doesn't give you the right to intimidate or humiliate people based on your own prejudices." Bradley's face was pale now, his hands fidgeting with the documents he still held. I understand, ma'am. And I truly am sorry." Olivia's gaze didn't waver. "You're sorry now because you realize who I am," she said. "But what if I weren't a federal judge? What if I were just another black woman trying to get home after a long day? Would you have treated me any differently?" Okay." The crowd erupted into quiet applause, the tension in the air thick with shared anger and respect for Olivia's words. Bradley swallowed hard, his eyes darting toward the patrol car, then back to Olivia. I don't know," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Olivia took a step back, straightening her blazer again. "Then maybe it's time you figure that out," she said. She turned toward the crowd, her eyes scanning the faces of those watching. "This isn't just about me," she said, her voice carrying clearly. "This is about all of us. About what we allow, what we accept, and what we demand to change." The crowd cheered, their voices filled with approval and admiration. Bradley stood frozen, the weight of his actions bearing down on him as Olivia returned to her car. The air around the scene was electric, charged with tension and anticipation. The crowd, now a small throng of onlookers, inched closer. Phones were held high, their screens glowing in the dimming light as they captured every word and movement. Olivia stood tall, her gaze steady as she turned to address the growing audience. "This isn't just about me," she said, her voice calm but firm, cutting through the murmurs. "It's about what happens every day to people like me, people who are judged not by their actions, but by the color of their skin." A ripple of agreement ran through the crowd. "That's right," someone shouted. A young woman near the front nodded, tears brimming in her eyes as she whispered, "She's saying what we've all felt." Behind Olivia, Bradley shifted uncomfortably, his authority unraveling under the weight of her words and the crowd's scrutiny. He raised a hand as if to reclaim control. I was just doing my job, he said, his voice defensive and strained. It wasn't personal. Um, but Olivia turned sharply to face him, her expression unwavering. Not personal, she repeated. Her tone was measured, but each word carried a sharp edge. You stopped me without cause. You demanded to search my car. And when I questioned you, you escalated the situation. Tell me, Officer Bradley, what exactly made you suspect me? Was it my car, my clothes, or was it my skin? The crowd gasped, a collective intake of breath that echoed Olivia's pointed question. Bradley looked like a man cornered, his eyes darting between her and the onlookers. Um, I, he began, but the words faltered. The young man in the hoodie stepped forward, his phone still recording. Yeah, officer, he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. We'd all love to hear the answer to that. Bradley's face flushed red. I don't have to explain myself to you, he snapped. But his voice lacked conviction, and his posture betrayed his unease. Olivia took a step forward, her presence commanding. You don't have to explain yourself, she said, her voice rising slightly. But you do have to answer for your actions. Because this isn't just about one traffic stop. It's about a pattern, a system that allows this kind of behavior to go unchecked. The crowd erupted into applause, their cheers ringing out in support. Bradley flinched at the noise, his authority crumbling further under the weight of the moment. I've seen this too many times, Olivia continued, turning back to the crowd. Her voice softened slightly, but her resolve remained. Families torn apart because of profiling. Young men and women treated as threats instead of as people. Lives derailed over assumptions and biases. Nia, I've seen some monsters out here, and I've seen men and women treated as threats instead of as people. She paused, her gaze sweeping over the faces of those watching. And it has to stop. Bradley crossed his arms, his face set in a mixture of defiance and discomfort. Look, I didn't mean. But you did, Olivia interrupted, her voice cutting through his excuse. You meant to assert your power. You meant to make me feel small. And when you realized I wouldn't back down, you meant to intimidate me further. That's the truth, isn't it? Bradley opened his mouth to respond, but the words never came. The crowd murmured again, their voices rising in support of Olivia. A middle-aged man in a baseball cap called out, "She's got you there, buddy." The crowd chuckled, the tension easing slightly as they rallied around Olivia. She turned back to Bradley, her tone softening slightly but still firm. This isn't just about holding you accountable. It's about understanding the impact of what you've done, not just to me, but to every person who's ever felt targeted for simply existing. Taking a deep breath, Olivia addressed the crowd once more. Let me share something with you all, she began. I've worked on cases where profiling destroyed lives. One young man I represented lost his scholarship because of a false accusation. Another man spent months in jail before evidence cleared him. Evidence that was ignored because someone assumed he was guilty. For years, he took a breather after it because the judge affirmed his innocence. His original practitioner sentenced him to life, and he never gets to do what he loves. The crowd grew quiet, hanging on her every word. BS isn't just a mistake, she continued. It's a choice. A choice to ignore facts and instead cling to stereotypes. And those choices have real consequences. It's not fun, but social media has made it easier and more acceptable to shoulder a lot of burdens. Quote, unquote, my BS isn't just a mistake, she continued. It's a choice. She looked back at Bradley, her gaze steady. I'm not asking for perfection. I'm asking for accountability. I'm asking for the system to change so that this doesn't keep happening. The crowd broke into applause again, the noise echoing down the street. Even some of the bystanders who had been quietly observing now clapped, their faces alight with admiration and agreement. Bradley lowered his head, his arms uncrossing as he let out a breath. He began. but his voice was barely audible. "You can start by listening," Olivia said, her voice gentler now. "That's the first step." The crowd cheered louder, their voices united in a shared call for justice. Olivia stood tall, her presence commanding, as the weight of her words settled over everyone present. The video hit social media within minutes. Clips of Olivia's calm defiance, her powerful words, and Bradley's fumbling attempts to justify his actions spread like wildfire. By the time Olivia pulled into her driveway that evening, the hashtags were already trending. Judge Carter, end racial profiling, and justice for all. Millions watched, shared, and commented. Some hailed Olivia as a hero, a symbol of dignity and strength in the face of blatant injustice. "This is what systemic racism looks like," one tweet read, paired with the now iconic quip of Olivia saying, "Was it my car, my clothes, or my skin?" News outlets picked up the story, and within hours it was on every major platform. The local police department issued a terse statement acknowledging the incident and promising an investigation. But that wasn't enough to quell the growing fury. By morning, the department's inbox was flooded with emails demanding accountability. Protesters gathered outside the station, holding signs that read, "End profiling now," and "Justice for all." The pressure mounted, and the police chief had no choice but to act. "Officer Bradley has been suspended pending an internal investigation," the chief announced in a hastily called press conference. His tone was measured, but the strain was evident. "We take these allegations seriously and are committed to ensuring accountability." On a heel-good, see y'all next podcast. For Bradley, the suspension was a public reckoning. Meanwhile, Olivia stood at the center of a storm she hadn't sought but couldn't ignore. 2 days after the incident, she stepped up to a podium outside the courthouse, cameras flashing and microphones pointed in her direction. Dressed in her signature black blazer, she looked every bit the dignified figure the public had come to admire. "I want to start by saying this," she began, her voice calm but resolute. "What happened to me is not unique. It is a reality faced by countless people across this country every single day. I had the privilege and the knowledge to defend myself, but many don't. And that's why this must change. This is not about one officer or one department," she said. "This is about a system that allows bias to go unchecked. It's about the policies, or lack thereof, that enable these moments to happen over and over again. And it's about the lives that are disrupted, the dignity that is stolen, because of assumptions and prejudice." Her words were firm, but filled with empathy, a tone that resonated deeply. "I'm calling for better training," she said. "Not just sensitivity training, but real, actionable education that addresses the root causes of bias. I'm calling for accountability, not just for individual officers, but for the systems that allow this behavior to persist. And I'm calling for courage from all of us to confront these issues head on." The press conference ended with thunderous applause from the onlookers. Videos of her speech spread just as quickly as the footage of the traffic stop, her message resonating with communities far and wide. Civil rights organizations were quick to respond. Activists reached out to Olivia, eager to amplify her voice and use her story as a platform for broader reform. Leaders from prominent groups like the NAACP and ACLU praised her for turning her ordeal into a powerful call for change. I'm sending her good luck. Oh, good luck. We need more leaders like Judge Carter," one activist said during a televised interview. "Her story reminds us that accountability is possible, but only if we demand it." Rallies sprang up in cities across the country, with signs bearing Olivia's face and slogans like "Justice starts here" and "Accountability for all." The momentum was undeniable. Olivia, though overwhelmed by the attention, stayed focused on the larger goal. Her story wasn't just a viral moment. It became a movement, a rallying cry for those who had experienced similar injustices, and a beacon of hope for those fighting for a fairer system. And through it all, Olivia remained grounded. She knew the road ahead would be long. That change wouldn't come easily. But as she stood on that stage, looking out at the faces of those who believed in her, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time: hope. She said, eventually, the water parted separately and became the entire world, a part of which time flew by. This was bigger than her, and she was ready to lead the charge. The story of Olivia Carter and her confrontation with Officer Bradley became a flashpoint for change. Across the country, people from all walks of life began discussing the deeper issues it highlighted: systemic racism, unchecked bias, and the urgent need for police reform. Community halls buzzed with debates. Town hall meetings overflowed with citizens demanding accountability. Social media, which had been the catalyst for spreading the story, now brimmed with posts calling for actionable solutions. End racial profiling was no longer just a trending hashtag, it was a rallying cry. Lawmakers took notice. Olivia, already a respected figure in the legal world, found herself at the forefront of these conversations. Invitations poured in from local governments and advocacy groups, each asking for her insight on how to address the underlying issues her case had exposed. Standing before a panel of senators during a public hearing, Olivia's presence was commanding yet approachable. She began her testimony with a pointed statement. "This isn't about one officer or one mistake," she said, her voice steady. "This is about a system that fails to hold itself accountable. And it's about the people, everyday people, who bear the burden of those failures." She went on to outline specific reforms, speaking with the clarity and conviction of someone who had seen the system's flaws up close. "We need mandatory sensitivity training for all officers," she said. "Not just a one-time seminar, but ongoing education that addresses implicit bias and teaches officers how to engage with diverse communities respectfully." And that's how she puts it. The room fell silent as she continued. "We also need stricter oversight of traffic stops. Every stop should be documented: why it was initiated, how it was handled, and what the outcome was. Transparency is the first step toward rebuilding trust." Her words struck a chord. Lawmakers, community leaders, and activists began drafting policies inspired by her recommendations. Cities across the country piloted programs to track police interactions, with dashboards that made the data accessible to the public. Departments introduced mandatory training modules, consulted experts in racial equity to design the curriculum. And Olivia didn't stop there. She partnered with civil rights organizations to develop a toolkit for communities, empowering citizens to understand their rights and hold law enforcement accountable. But amid the sweeping reforms, one person struggled to reconcile his role in the story: Officer Bradley. Suspended from duty and publicly scrutinized, Bradley had become a symbol of the systemic issues Olivia fought against. Yet behind the headlines, he grappled with personal reflection. For the first time in his career, he was forced to confront the biases that had shaped his actions. Sitting in his modest kitchen late one evening, Bradley scrolled through the viral videos of the incident. He saw himself through the eyes of the public, imposing, dismissive, and blinded by prejudice. It was an unflattering portrait, but one he couldn't deny. He hesitated for days before reaching out to Olivia. When he finally did, his voice was subdued, almost hesitant. "Judge Carter," he began, "I know I'm the last person you want to hear from, but I need to say this. I'm sorry. Not just for how I treated you, but for what it says about me. I need to change, and I don't know where to start." Olivia listened in silence, her expression unreadable. She had every reason to dismiss him, to let him grapple with his mistakes alone. But she also believed in the power of education and redemption. "Meet me at the courthouse next week," she said finally. "We'll talk." The meeting was private, held in Olivia's chambers. Bradley arrived looking nervous and uncertain, a far cry from the man who had loomed over her car window just weeks before. "I'm not here to absolve you," Olivia said, her tone direct. "But I am here to help you understand. Change doesn't happen unless we're willing to confront our own biases, and that's not easy." For hours they talked, Olivia shared stories of cases she'd worked on, men and women who had been profiled, arrested, or worse because of assumptions made about them. She shared statistics and studies illustrating the systemic patterns that created such injustices. And Bradley listened. He asked questions, some clumsy, others insightful, but all genuine. I thought I was doing my job, he admitted at one point, but I see now that I was letting my biases guide me. I never thought of myself as racist, but he trailed off, his face heavy with regret. Feru el Dazubiber. Olivia nodded. Acknowledging it is the first step, but the real work comes next. Their conversation became the foundation for something larger. Bradley volunteered to participate in one of the training programs Olivia had advocated for, sharing his story as an example of how even well-intentioned officers could go astray. The journey wasn't easy. For Bradley, it was humbling. For Olivia, it was a reminder that progress required patience. But together, they demonstrated that change, while difficult, was possible. As Olivia returned to her work, she carried with her a renewed sense of purpose. The policies she championed, the conversations she sparked, and even the small steps taken by people like Bradley all pointed to a brighter future. And here's the system was far from perfect, but it was moving forward. And for Olivia, that was worth fighting for. The community center buzzed with energy, the crowd filling every seat and lining the walls. People of all ages and backgrounds had come to hear Olivia Carter speak. Her story had resonated far and wide, and tonight they gathered not just to listen, but to reflect on what it meant for their community and their country. Unquote. As Olivia stepped onto the stage, the room fell silent. She stood tall, her presence commanding yet approachable. Dressed simply in a navy blazer and slacks, she exuded the quiet strength that had become her hallmark. She began with a deep breath, her gaze sweeping the room. "Thank you for being here," she said, her voice steady. "What happened to me that night wasn't unique. It was personal, yes, but it was also a symptom of something much larger. A system that allows bias to thrive unchecked." The audience leaned in, her words drawing them closer. "This isn't about one officer or one traffic stop," Olivia continued. "It's about the lives that are disrupted, the dignity that's stripped away, and the trust that's eroded because of these everyday injustices. And if we don't address it, if we don't work together to change it, it will continue to harm generation after generation." Her voice softened, but her conviction remained unshakable. But here's the thing. Change is possible. It starts with awareness. It grows through action, and it takes root when we hold ourselves and each other accountable. A ripple of agreement passed through the crowd, murmurs of "that's right" and "amen" punctuating her words. Olivia's gaze shifted, meeting the eyes of several individuals in the audience as she spoke. "Each of us has a role to play," she said. "Whether it's speaking up when we see injustice, voting for leaders who prioritize equity, or simply having honest conversations about the biases we carry. It all matters. Every step we take matters." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. "This isn't a fight that ends with one policy or one law. It's ongoing, and it's hard, but it's worth it. Because a world where everyone feels seen, valued, and respected is worth fighting for." The room erupted into applause, the sound echoing off the walls like a wave of hope and determination. Olivia stepped back for a moment, her chest rising with the weight of the moment, before continuing. "Go. I want you to leave here tonight with this in mind," she said. "Discrimination divides us, but courage and compassion bring us together. Let's choose to be brave. Let's choose to act. Let's choose to build a world where no one has to wonder if they belong." Tears glistened in the eyes of some in the audience. Others stood, clapping loudly, their applause a reflection of their shared commitment to the cause. As Olivia left the stage, the crowd remained standing, their cheers filling the space. She felt a swell of hope rise within her. This wasn't the end of the journey, it was only the beginning. Her story had become a beacon, but the legacy it inspired belonged to everyone. Together, they could create the change she had always believed in.